At 8:45 p.m., we were at the movies. A man walked up behind us, whispering in my fiancée's ear. Then he asked if I was her brother. I always thought movie nights were the simplest form of happiness. A dark room, a big screen, and the woman I was planning to spend my life with sitting beside me. It felt safe, familiar. That Friday evening was supposed to be just that. A break from a week full of deadlines and the stress of wedding planning. Caroline had been pushing for us to go out more, not just sit at home, so I booked us tickets to a late showing at the big theater downtown. By the time we walked into the lobby, it was already buzzing. Couples holding popcorn buckets too big to finish, groups of friends laughing as they rushed to their seats, kids running ahead of their parents. Everything felt ordinary. I even teased her about how much butter she poured onto the popcorn, and she laughed the way she always did. Light, easy, the kind of laugh that made strangers smile without knowing why. We sat in the middle rows, surrounded by people settling in. Caroline leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder as the preview started. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked in that moment, and how lucky I was that someone like her had chosen me. Then, at 8:45 p.m., everything changed. I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. Someone slid into the row behind us, quietly, as if they didn't want to disturb anyone. At first I thought nothing of it. The theater was filling up, after all. But then the figure leaned forward. A man's voice, low but clear, whispered directly into Caroline's ear. I felt her whole body tense against me, her shoulders stiffening. She didn't turn toward me. She didn't laugh it off. She just froze, the way someone does when they've been caught doing something they shouldn't. Before I could even react, the man chuckled softly. Then he said something that flipped my stomach upside down. He asked if I was her brother. The casual tone of it made my blood boil. Who whispers something like that into a woman's ear if they're strangers? And why would he assume I was her brother unless there was a history there, something more than just coincidence? I turned my head quickly, ready to tell him off, but he was already leaning back into his seat, like nothing had happened. I only caught a glimpse of his face in the flickering light from the screen, sharp features, an easy smirk, and eyes that didn't even acknowledge me. They were locked on her. Caroline finally shifted, forcing a nervous laugh, and whispered that she didn't know him. She told me to ignore it, that some people were just creepy. But her hand fumbled with the popcorn bucket, her fingers trembling slightly. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I had been with her long enough to know the difference between irritation and fear. And this wasn't irritation. She wasn't annoyed at being harassed by a stranger. She was terrified that I might ask more questions. I sat there for a few more minutes, trying to calm myself down, but the movie was nothing more than blurry images on the screen. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The way she froze, the way the man smiled, the way his words cut deeper than they should have. Eventually, I leaned close and told her we should leave. She hesitated, clearly not wanting to draw attention, but when I stood, she followed quickly. We stepped out into the lobby, the muffled sound of the movie echoing behind us. She tried to brush it off again, saying he was just some idiot messing with us. I asked her why he thought I was her brother. She had no answer, just a shrug and a quick change of subject. She wanted to go home. She insisted it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. A stranger doesn't lean in that close unless there's history, and a man doesn't risk saying something like that in public unless he knows something she hasn't told me. The car ride back was silent. She stared out the window, avoiding eye contact, while I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I should have. Every red light felt like an interrogation room. I wanted to demand answers, but I also knew pressing her then and there wouldn't get me the truth. When we got home, she moved quickly, changing into pajamas, brushing her teeth, slipping under the covers like she was desperate to erase the evening. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the half-eaten popcorn we'd carried out of the theater. I could still hear the man's voice in my head, the mocking edge of it, the way he had said brother like it was a punchline. That night, I barely slept. Caroline seemed restless too, tossing and turning beside me, waking up twice to check her phone. She thought I didn't notice, but I did. And with every vibration of that screen, my suspicion grew heavier. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, hummed a tune under her breath, and even kissed me on the cheek before heading out for work. But the act was too clean, too rehearsed. I could feel the distance between us like a wall. I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it really was just some creep trying to mess with her. But then I remembered the way he smiled, the way she froze, the way she avoided every single question. That wasn't coincidence. That was history. And once the seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't stop growing. I spent the day at work in a fog, barely hearing what my coworkers said. All I could think about was Caroline, that man, and what connected them. The more I tried to dismiss it, the stronger the suspicion became. By the time I got home, I had already decided something important. I wasn't going to confront her again. At least not yet. If she was hiding something, she would only lie to protect it. I needed to see for myself. I needed to watch, listen, and collect enough to know exactly what was going on. That decision marked the beginning of a shift in me. I had always trusted her completely, never once questioning her late nights or sudden plans. But from that night at the theater onward, I couldn't look at her without wondering what else she was keeping from me. Caroline noticed my quietness, of course. She asked if I was still upset about the movie creep, as she called him. I told her no, but she didn't believe me. I saw it in her eyes, that flicker of guilt, that hesitation in her smile. She went to bed early again, leaving me alone in the living room. I sat there in the dark, replaying every moment of the night before, every second of that whisper. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about some guy in a movie theater. This was about whether the woman I loved was already slipping away from me, and whether I was willing to find out the truth no matter how much it hurt. The morning after the theater incident, I woke up with the same uneasy weight in my chest. Caroline had already left for work by the time I got up, but I knew she hadn't slept well. I'd heard her moving around at 3 a.m., pacing quietly in the hallway as if she didn't want to wake me. By the time I stumbled out of bed, she had slipped back under the covers, feigning sleep. That detail stuck with me throughout the day. I kept asking myself why she couldn't just say what was bothering her, why she chose silence instead of honesty. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the stranger at the theater hadn't been a random pest. He had known her. His words hadn't been playful. They'd been calculated, meant to provoke me, maybe even test her. I decided I couldn't just rely on instinct. If she was lying, I needed something concrete. I've never thought of myself as suspicious by nature, but that night changed everything. It planted a seed I couldn't ignore. That week, I started paying attention to her routines in ways I never had before. I noticed her phone was always face down on the table. She had started bringing her charger everywhere, even to work, something she'd never done before. And she guarded her purse like it contained state secrets, never leaving it unattended. The first real crack appeared on Wednesday evening. I had finished work early and drove by her office, planning to surprise her with dinner. But her car wasn't in the employee lot. I called her, and she answered quickly, claiming she was still finishing some paperwork. I hung up, staring at the empty parking space where her car should have been. I drove around the surrounding streets, and 15 minutes later, I spotted her vehicle. Not by her office, but parked discreetly down a narrow side street 2 blocks away. The engine was cold, which meant she'd been there for some time. I didn't see her inside, but the evidence was undeniable. She hadn't been where she said she was. When she came home later, she smelled faintly of cologne, one that wasn't mine. Not overwhelming, but noticeable, lingering like an unwanted guest. She kissed me on the cheek and busied herself with making tea, as if rushing to wash away whatever traces of her evening remained. That was the moment I realized I couldn't rely on casual observation alone. If I wanted answers, I'd need proof. I started small. She used her laptop frequently for work, and we shared it when necessary. I knew her login password, though she had recently changed it. Luckily, she had written the new one on a sticky note tucked inside her desk drawer. That night, after she went to bed, I opened the laptop. The first thing I noticed was that she had created a separate profile, something she had never done before. It was locked with a password I didn't have, but the main profile still contained traces of her activity. I checked the browser history, but it was wiped clean. No social media logins, no email accounts. Too clean. Which, ironically, told me more than if she'd left it messy. Curiosity drove me deeper. I searched through the system files and stumbled across a folder hidden under an obscure name. Inside, there were fragments of cached images and chat logs. Most of it was mundane, but then I found a series of text exchanges copied automatically by the system. They weren't addressed by name, just initials. One message in particular stood out. Same place Friday? Don't bring your phone this time. Another. He doesn't suspect anything yet. Don't worry. My pulse raced as I read the lines. The wording was vague, but the intent was clear. Whoever she was meeting, she was worried about being caught. And worse, she was confident that I had no idea. But the discovery that froze me was a photo buried deeper in the folder. It was low resolution, probably taken quickly, but unmistakable. Caroline, at a bar, leaning against the same man from the theater. His arm rested casually around her waist, and she was smiling. Not the polite smile she gave strangers, but the warm, familiar one she used on me. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling. That single image confirmed what I had been trying to deny. He wasn't just some creep. He was someone she knew intimately, someone she was willing to risk everything for. The next morning, I watched her carefully as she prepared for work. She hummed softly, tying her hair back, slipping on her coat like it was any other day. I wanted to throw the laptop down in front of her and demand answers, but something inside me stopped. If I revealed what I knew too soon, she'd just lie, maybe even cover her tracks better. I needed more. So I played the part of the oblivious fiancé. I kissed her goodbye, wished her a good day, and watched her walk out the door. But beneath the surface, I was already planning my next move. That evening, when she said she was meeting a coworker for a late client consultation, I decided to follow her. I parked a block away from her office and waited. She arrived in her car, but instead of going inside, she walked down the street briskly, glancing over her shoulder once. I kept my distance. She turned the corner and entered a cafe. Through the glass, I saw her sit at a table, checking her phone nervously. A few minutes later, the man from the theater walked in. He sat across from her, and she smiled instantly, reaching out to touch his hand. It was the confirmation I needed, but it felt like my chest was collapsing in on itself. I snapped a photo with my phone, just enough to capture their faces and their hands touching across the table. Then I left before she could notice me. That night, she came home late, claiming the meeting had gone longer than expected. She looked tired, even exasperated, and apologized for missing dinner. She leaned down to kiss me, and I let her, though the bitterness inside me made the gesture feel hollow. She went upstairs to shower, and as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "You're not the only one watching her. He's not who she says he is." I stared at the words, my stomach nodding. Attached to the message was a short video clip. Caroline and the same man walking into a building together, his hand on her lower back. The footage wasn't mine. Someone else had been following them, someone with their own agenda. And that changed everything. The anonymous message sat on my phone like a live grenade. I must have read it 10 times in a row, hoping the words would shift, hoping I had misinterpreted them. But they didn't change. Someone else was watching her. Someone else knew about Julian. It wasn't just the text itself, it was the attached video. Caroline and Julian stepping into a building together, close enough to look like a couple. The video had been taken from across the street, clearly by someone who had been tailing them. The shaky frame suggested it wasn't professional surveillance, but personal, the kind of footage someone records when they're fueled by anger or betrayal. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I saved the video and backed it up in multiple places, just in case. Whoever had sent it wanted me to know something, but they hadn't introduced themselves. That made me cautious. The next few days were tense. Caroline carried on like everything was normal, making dinner, asking about my day, leaving for work at the same times as always. But every interaction felt scripted. I couldn't look at her without replaying the image of her with Julian, laughing across that cafe table. On Thursday evening, she told me she had another late client consultation. This time, I didn't hesitate. I followed her. She parked in a different area this time, further from her office, and walked quickly toward the edge of town. I stayed several cars behind, my headlights off when possible, relying on street lamps to guide me. She eventually stopped at a small motel, the kind of place people use for secrecy rather than comfort. My stomach dropped as I watched her glance around nervously before slipping inside. I pulled over across the street and waited. 30 minutes passed, then 45. Finally, the door to one of the rooms opened. Julian stepped out first, adjusting his jacket. Caroline followed, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression a mix of satisfaction and guilt. They kissed quickly before parting ways. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had proof now, undeniable proof. But instead of rushing across the street to confront them, I forced myself to stay put. Bursting in would only give her the chance to twist the narrative. I needed more than emotion, I needed strategy. As soon as they left, I drove by the motel and noted the room number. Then I circled back home before she did. When she walked through the door later, claiming her meeting had run long again, I smiled and nodded, pretending nothing was wrong. Inside, though, I was building a plan. The anonymous number returned the following evening with another message. "You saw it, didn't you? You're not crazy. She's been doing this for months." I hesitated, then replied, "Who are you?" No immediate response. Hours passed. Then, just before midnight, another text arrived. "You don't need my name. Just know you're not the only one she's hurting." That line told me everything. Whoever this was, they had been wronged too. The next weekend, I decided to test a theory. I followed Caroline again, not in my car this time, but on foot after parking several blocks away. She made her way toward a restaurant near the river. As she slipped inside, I stayed outside, pretending to check my phone. That's when I noticed someone else lingering nearby, partially hidden behind a lamppost. A woman. She had a phone raised, recording Caroline's entrance. It clicked instantly. The anonymous messages hadn't come from a stranger or a friend of mine. They had come from someone tied to Julian. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. She noticed me anyway, her eyes widening in recognition. She didn't run, though. Instead, She lowered her phone slowly and crossed her arms. "You must be Thomas," she said, voice steady but edged with bitterness. I froze. She already knew my name. She introduced herself as Margaret. And then she confirmed what I suspected. She was Julian's wife. The ground seemed to shift under me. Julian wasn't just some random fling. He was married, and his wife had been tracking him the same way I had started tracking Caroline. She told me she'd been suspicious for months, collecting photos, videos, and records of his movements. She had enough evidence to bury him in divorce court. I asked her why she had reached out to me. She said she didn't want me to waste time doubting myself the way she had. She also admitted there was a certain satisfaction in letting me know my perfect engagement was as much of a lie as her marriage. I should have felt ashamed, exposed, even humiliated. Instead, I felt a grim kind of relief. At least I wasn't crazy. At least someone else saw what I saw. We compared notes in the quiet corner of a cafe nearby. She showed me more videos, Julian and Caroline in restaurants, walking hand in hand down side streets, even kissing openly in parking lots. My chest tightened with every clip, but I forced myself to watch. The more evidence I had, the stronger my position would be. Margaret told me she planned to file for divorce soon, and she wanted to use Caroline as leverage. If Julian thought his mistress's fiancé was involved, it would shake him. If Caroline realized her affair had consequences beyond sneaking around, she'd crumble too. I nodded, already seeing the outlines of a plan forming. That night, when Caroline came home, she acted overly affectionate, kissing me, asking if I wanted to order takeout, laughing a little too loudly at small jokes. It was guilt, written all over her face. And as much as it burned, I played along. Because now I knew how this would end. The next day, Margaret sent me a message. "We should coordinate. I'll take the legal side. You decide how you want to handle her." For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange calm. Not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because I had a clear direction. No more uncertainty. No more wondering. The game had shifted, and I wasn't alone anymore. I spent the weekend reviewing everything I had, photos, videos, the anonymous clips Margaret had provided. Together, they painted a picture so damning it couldn't be denied. I realized that Caroline and Julian had grown careless. They believed they were invisible, safe in their lies. They weren't. I started thinking about the engagement party we had planned for the following month. Family, friends, colleagues, all in one place. The perfect stage. The thought of calmly laying out the evidence in front of everyone made my pulse race. Humiliation might not erase what she'd done, but it would stop her from ever manipulating me again. When I glanced at Caroline across the room that evening, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. I forced myself to return the smile. She didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling. The days leading up to the engagement party felt like moving through two realities at once. On the surface, Caroline and I played the roles everyone expected, excited couple preparing for the next chapter of our lives. We picked out decorations, confirmed catering orders, and texted friends reminders about the date. She was radiant in public, glowing with the kind of joy that looked effortless. But beneath the performance, I watched every small crack. The way her smile dropped the moment she thought no one was looking. The long glances at her phone when she believed I was distracted. The faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers lingering on her coat after late nights at the office. I stayed silent. Not because I forgave, not because I doubted, but because silence was my weapon. She thought my quietness meant complacency. She had no idea it was preparation. Meanwhile, Margaret and I exchanged messages almost daily. She fed me evidence, timestamps, screenshots, photos, while I updated her on my plan. She was relentless, sharp, and far more controlled than I expected from someone in her position. Her goal was clear: destroy Julian in court. Mine was different: destroy the illusion Caroline had built for everyone around us. I wanted her lies to collapse in front of the same people she had smiled at, hugged, and reassured. Family, friends, colleagues, they all saw her as loyal and loving. The betrayal wasn't just mine to bear anymore. It was something I would drag into the light. The night of the party arrived faster than I anticipated. The venue was a small banquet hall rented for the evening, decorated with white tablecloths, flowers, and candles. It was elegant without being excessive, exactly the kind of event Caroline loved. Guests trickled in, laughing, carrying gifts, congratulating us with warm handshakes and hugs. My parents arrived early, beaming with pride. Her family followed soon after, equally enthusiastic. Caroline worked the room like a politician, greeting every guest with practiced ease. She looked stunning in her dress, her hair pinned perfectly, her smile dazzling. To anyone else, she seemed like the perfect fiancé. To me, she looked like a liar walking willingly into her own trial. Julian wasn't there, of course. Margaret had made sure of that. She had told him she needed to talk about their situation and scheduled it for the same evening. He thought she was finally willing to negotiate. In reality, she wanted him distracted while I executed my plan. As the evening progressed, people toasted to our future. My father gave a heartfelt speech about trust, loyalty, and the importance of building a life together. Caroline squeezed my hand during his words, her eyes shining. I nearly laughed at the hypocrisy. When it was my turn to speak, the room quieted. I stood, holding a glass of champagne, and looked around at the expectant faces. Caroline beamed beside me, certain I would deliver some charming anecdote about how we met or how excited I was for our future. Instead, I began with calm precision. I thanked everyone for being there, for supporting us, for believing in the relationship Caroline and I had built. Then I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle. I said that trust is the foundation of any partnership, and when that foundation cracks, the entire structure collapses. I pulled out my phone. The first photo appeared on the screen behind me, projected onto the venue's display system I had arranged earlier under the guise of showing a slideshow of our memories. But it wasn't a smiling photo of us. It was Caroline and Julian in that cafe, their hands touching across the table. Gasps filled the room. A few people laughed nervously, thinking it must be a mistake. Caroline's face drained of color. She stammered something under her breath, but before she could stop me, the next image appeared, them leaving the motel together. Another slide, a video clip of them walking into a building, his hand pressed against her lower back. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the hall. Her family exchanged horrified looks. My parents sat frozen in disbelief. Friends whispered to each other, covering their mouths. Caroline tried to grab the phone from my hand, but I stepped back. I told everyone the truth, that for months, while we planned our wedding, she had been sneaking away with another man. That the stranger who whispered in her ear at the movies hadn't been a random creep. He was her lover. That the night she had smiled at everyone here, she had already betrayed me. Her protests were loud, desperate. She claimed the photos were out of context, that Julian was just a friend, that I was twisting things. But the evidence was too clear, too damning. Every word she said made her look more guilty. Finally, I revealed the last slide. A message exchange, captured by Margaret, where Caroline promised Julian I was oblivious and that their relationship would only need to stay hidden until the wedding. That was the nail in the coffin. The room erupted. Some guests shouted in disbelief. Others shook their heads in disgust. Her parents stood speechless, her mother covering her mouth with trembling hands. My father muttered something under his breath, unable to look at her. Caroline's composure shattered. She burst into tears, pleading with me to stop, insisting we could work through it privately. But I had no intention of shielding her anymore. I ended my speech with a simple statement. The engagement was over. I told her family she would not be joining mine, and I would not be marrying someone who treated trust like a game. Then I set the microphone down and walked out of the hall, leaving the murmurs, gasps, and her sobs behind me. Margaret called later that night. She had confronted Julian with her evidence at nearly the same time. She said he tried to deny everything at first, but when she laid out the videos, the photos, and even Caroline's messages, he broke. She told me she filed for divorce the next morning. The fallout was swift. Caroline tried to reach me dozens of times, texts, calls, even showing up at my apartment. I ignored them all. She left long messages about how it had been a mistake, how she never meant for it to go that far, how she still wanted the life we planned. But her pleas meant nothing. I had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. Her reputation collapsed almost instantly. Word of the engagement party disaster spread fast. Friends distanced themselves. Her coworkers whispered behind her back. Even her family struggled to defend her, especially after seeing the evidence themselves. She became isolated, her carefully constructed image of the perfect fiancé crumbling into dust. As for me, it wasn't easy. Betrayal doesn't fade overnight. There were days I replayed the footage in my mind, tormenting myself with the details. But there was also a deep, undeniable satisfaction. She hadn't just betrayed me, she had underestimated me. And in the end, her downfall wasn't private. It was as public as her lies had been. Margaret and I kept in touch for a while, mostly to exchange updates on the aftermath. Julian lost heavily in the divorce, financial penalties, public humiliation, and the implosion of his professional reputation once the affair became known. Caroline was left scrambling, cut off from the security she thought she could guarantee. Months later, when the dust had settled, I looked back at that night at the movies, the whisper in her ear, the mocking question about whether I was her brother. It all made sense now. Julian had tested the waters, confident in their secrecy, bold enough to taunt me in public. He thought I was blind. He thought I would never dig. He was wrong. And Caroline learned the same lesson in front of everyone she cared about. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it doesn't just disappear quietly. It shatters, and the pieces cut deeper than anyone expects. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.